The first time Leslie Nielsen ever met Priscilla Presley, he didn't say hello. He pulled a whoopee cushion out of his pocket and set it off right in front of her. She said she genuinely didn't know how to react in that moment, still carrying years of quiet grief nobody on that film set could see. Then he started, and something in her finally loosened. What Priscilla did next, take after take on the set of The Naked Gun, laughing so hard the crew had to keep stopping the cameras, has never really been told as its own story. It should be, because underneath all that comedy were two people who'd both spent years learning how to survive long before they ever learned how to make each other laugh. Leslie Nielsen's own survival began decades earlier and thousands of miles away, in Fort Norman, a tiny outpost in Canada's Northwest Territories, where his Danish-born father, Ingvard, worked as a constable with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a job that carried real authority and public respect in that small, isolated community. Behind that respectable uniform was a violent man. Nielsen later spoke openly about growing up in a household where his father beat his mother and his brothers, admitting that he learned very early how to perform, how to become someone else entirely, simply to survive the unpredictability of his own home, slipping into different voices and characters as a kind of quiet. The family relocated to Edmonton in 1930 when Leslie was still a small child, but the damage from those early years in Fort Norman stayed with him. He carried another hidden burden into adulthood, too. A childhood illness had left him legally deaf, a condition he managed with hearing aids for the rest of his life, something he rarely discussed publicly, but which shaped nearly every professional choice he made, from the way he studied a scene partner's lips to the way he timed his own line readings against cues he sometimes couldn't fully hear. Despite that, at 17, desperate to escape his father's house, Nielsen enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force and became a gunnery sergeant, one of the more unlikely accomplishments of a legally deaf teenager fleeing violence at home, training as an aerial gunner during the final years of the Second World War, even though he was ultimately too young to be sent overseas. Decades later, reflecting on what that hidden disability actually meant for an actor's career, he was remarkably candid. It's very difficult to be an actor and to have people depending on you to say the right line at the right time and to not be able to hear your cues, he admitted. My hearing aids are a lifesaver. They allow me to practice my craft. His older brother, Eric Nielsen, would go on to become Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, a strange and telling contrast between two boys who'd survived the exact same household and ended up on opposite ends of public life, one commanding a government, the other commanding a room full of laughter. A scholarship to New York's Neighborhood Playhouse pointed Nielsen toward acting instead, and for the next 3 decades, he built a long, respectable, and largely unremarkable career as a dramatic actor. His first screen credit came in 1950 on the live television anthology series Studio One, and at just 24, he found himself frequently cast as the dashing young leading man in similar productions, though the field was crowded with actors of exactly that same type, and nothing about those early years made him stand out from the pack.
He appeared in the 1956 science fiction landmark Forbidden Planet as the commanding officer of humanity's first interstellar starship, a film now considered a genre-defining cult classic, and played the romantic lead opposite Debbie Reynolds in 1957's Tammy and the Bachelor. Frustrated by 1959, he auditioned for Ben-Hur and didn't get the part, returning instead to television, where he headlined Disney's The Swamp Fox, and later a police drama called The New Breed, both of which were canceled after a single season, despite his hopes for each. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, he kept working steadily as a guest performer on some of the era's most popular shows, quietly accepting, as the decades wore on, that leading man's stardom in film simply wasn't going to happen for him. He gravitated instead towards supporting roles in the disaster films that dominated 1970s box offices, becoming a reliable, serious presence audiences trusted without ever really noticing his name.
That resignation is exactly what made him perfect for what came next. When directors Jim Abrahams and David and Jerry Zucker set out to parody the entire disaster genre in 1980's Airplane, they specifically wanted the genuinely serious character actors of that world, the men audiences had spent a decade taking completely seriously, and told them to deliver the most absurd dialogue imaginable with total, straight-faced sincerity. Nielsen, at 54 years old, delivered it so convincingly that critics assumed he must be some kind of undiscovered comic genius, when really, he was simply doing what he'd spent 30 years training to do, playing a doctor, calmly informing a panicked cabin that a hospital is a big building with patients, but that isn't important right now. A joke that only works if the man delivering it never once winks at the audience. The same quality that works for both drama and comedy is credibility, he explained later. You must be believed. And then it can be really funny, especially insanity. If you believe insanity, then it can be funny indeed. Airplane was a smash hit, and critics praised Nielsen specifically for playing so completely against type, not realizing he was simply doing what he'd been quietly perfecting his entire career. The filmmaking team loved working with him so much, they built an entire follow-up series around him, casting Nielsen as Lieutenant Frank Drebin in the deadpan cop parody Police Squad, a show that played every absurd twist with total sincerity, the same way Airplane had. Despite building a devoted fan base almost immediately, it got canceled after just 4 episodes aired, with ABC's own head of programming later admitting the humor demanded more attention than casual television viewers were willing to give it, a kind of comedy that simply didn't belong on the small screen because you had to actually watch it closely to catch the joke. Failure, again, seemingly for good this time, except home video changed everything. Police Squad became a runaway rental hit throughout the mid-1980s, and Paramount, realizing its mistake, greenlit a feature film version nobody at the network had believed in 3 years earlier. By the time The Naked Gun went into production in 1988, Nielsen was 62 years old and about to become, for the first time in his life, a genuine leading man. The film needed a female lead to match his deadpan energy,
and the role was originally intended for Bo Derek until her husband and regular director refused to let her take it. The producers turned, somewhat unexpectedly, to Priscilla Presley. Priscilla had spent most of her adult life defined by a story that had nothing to do with acting at all. Born Priscilla Ann Wagner to a military family, she met Elvis Presley as a 14-year-old living on an army base in Germany, an encounter that would quietly reroute the entire rest of her life. She eventually moved to Graceland, married him in 1967, and had their only child, Lisa Marie, the following year, before the marriage unraveled under the pressure of Elvis's touring schedule, his infidelities, and the isolating strangeness of being the king of rock and roll's wife. They separated after 5 turbulent years together and divorced in 1973. 4 years later, in August of 1977, Elvis died suddenly at just 42 years old, and Priscilla, only in her early 30s herself, was thrust overnight into the impossible role of the most famous widow in America, a title the entire world felt entitled to have an opinion about, even though the couple had already been divorced for years by that point. She spent the years afterwards slowly rebuilding an identity that belonged to her alone, eventually landing a recurring role on the primetime soap Dallas as Jenna Wade, one of the show's central romantic figures, proving to herself and to a skeptical industry that she could actually act. But nothing in that resume, built entirely on earnest, straight-faced drama, had prepared her for slapstick, deadpan comedy, or a scene partner like Leslie Nielsen.
He broke the ice immediately and permanently. Their very first meeting, Nielsen greeted her not with a handshake, but with his favorite prop, a hidden whoopee cushion he carried everywhere, setting it off the moment they were introduced. A gag he reportedly played on nearly every new co-star and crew member he ever worked with, though few of them arrived carrying quite as much unspoken weight as Priscilla did that day. "I didn't know how to react," Priscilla later wrote in a tribute essay. "He saw the look on my face and started laughing. He took his hand from his pocket and pulled out this gadget that he carried with him all the time, his whoopee cushion. That prank broke the ice to a friendship I will always cherish." From that moment forward, keeping a straight face across from him became nearly impossible. "It was difficult to get through a scene with Leslie Nielsen," she said years later, reflecting on the shoot with obvious warmth. "He would start laughing, crying with laughing, until the director would come and say, 'Okay, kids, we're going to take this seriously. Now we're on our 4th take.' And as he's talking to me, I'm looking away, I'm cracking up. He was so good, so deadpan. Well, I was good too." She's since admitted she usually couldn't get through even the 1st or 2nd take of any scene they shared, the two of them repeatedly derailing entire days of shooting simply by making each other laugh. That closeness ran deeper than shared giggling fits between takes. Both of them had arrived at that soundstage, carrying versions of the same quiet burden, decades spent being underestimated, boxed into someone else's expectations of who they were supposed to be. Nielsen had spent 30 years being politely ignored as a dramatic actor before anyone gave him permission to be genuinely, fully himself a man whose entire childhood had trained him to perform steadiness on command, first out of fear, later out of craft. Priscilla had spent a decade being treated as an extension of Elvis's legend rather than a person with her own instincts and ambitions. An actress with essentially zero comedy experience being handed one of the biggest comic franchises of the decade. expected by a skeptical industry to fail quietly and disappear back into the tabloids. Neither of them had any business believing they'd nail it. They did anyway, together. And something about surviving that particular kind of doubt, side by side, turned into real, lasting affection, rather than the usual polite, forgettable co-star relationship. She said he was always teaching her something new on set, that he simply made coming to work fun in a way almost nobody else in the industry ever had for her. A small, steady kindness that mattered enormously to a woman who'd spent years being treated as a headline rather than a colleague. For Nielsen by then, in his 60s, and finally belatedly famous on his own terms, there may have been something quietly meaningful, too, in mentoring someone else who understood exactly what it felt like to be underestimated by everyone in the room. The Naked Gun became an enormous hit, and Nielsen, at 62, was suddenly the biggest new comedy star in the country, headlining the #1 film in America, decades after he'd first accepted that leading man status was never going to happen for him. 2 sequels followed, The Naked Gun 2½, The Smell of Fear in 1991, and The Naked Gun 33 1/3, The Final Insult in 1994, both reuniting Nielsen and Presley, and both landing at #1 at the box office, an almost unheard-of late career run for a man who'd spent his 50s believing his best chances had already passed him by. Asked around this time whether he enjoyed the sudden wave of public affection, Nielsen didn't hide his delight. "I love particularly the affection that goes with the Naked Gun kind of humor," he said, comparing it to the warmth he felt walking out in front of a Saturday Night Live audience. There was just such a feeling of warmth. He kept working steadily through the rest of the decade and into the 2000s, teaming with Mel Brooks for 1995's Dracula, Dead and Loving It, a film that, despite failing at the box office, Nielsen played with the same total commitment he brought to everything else. 3 years later, in 1998's Wrongfully Accused, he took on an entire parody of the wrongly convicted fugitive thriller genre, almost single-handedly, playing a virtuoso violinist framed for murder and forced to prove his innocence while evading capture, delivering the same rapid-fire deadpan absurdity that had defined his career for 2 decades by that point. He went on to introduce an entirely new generation to his particular brand of comic sincerity as President Harris in the Scary Movie franchise, and spent his later years hosting Three Stooges shorts on cable television for a whole new wave of kids discovering physical comedy for the first time. Married 4 times in his life, his first 3 marriages ending in divorce under the pressure of a difficult, uneven career, Nielsen finally found lasting peace late in life with his 4th wife, Barbary Earl, married in 2001 and remaining together until his death. Leslie Nielsen died of complications from pneumonia on November 28, 2010, at 84 years old. Priscilla's tribute came almost immediately, raw with real grief rather than polite Hollywood formality. "I want to say how deeply stunned and saddened I am, as we all are, by the sudden passing of Leslie Nielsen," she wrote. "Having had the great fortune of working with Leslie on several films, I know firsthand how truly generous, funny, and talented he was. He was always teaching me something new, and he made coming to work so much fun. He was a brilliant and unique individual who was forever young at heart, and he will truly be missed." What makes that loss land even harder in hindsight is what was still ahead of her. A decade later, in 2020, Priscilla's grandson Benjamin Keogh died by suicide at 27, a devastating loss that came out of nowhere and shattered the family all over again. Not even 3 years after that, in January of 2023, her only child, Lisa Marie Presley, died suddenly at 54, a grief so profound that Priscilla has since described it as unlike anything else she has ever endured. The loss of a daughter, compounding decades of loss that had already started with Elvis himself. Two of the deepest wounds of Priscilla Presley's entire life arrived after the one friend who'd once known exactly how to pull her back from grief with nothing more than a whoopee cushion and a straight face was already gone. There was no Leslie Nielsen left to break the tension this time. No prop pulled from a pocket at exactly the right moment to remind her that laughter could still exist alongside sorrow. No deadpan scene partner to collapse into helpless giggling with between takes while the world outside kept asking too much of her. She had to find that balance entirely on her own, carrying decades of loss without the one collaborator who'd once made carrying it, if only for a few months on a film set, feel lighter. In the summer of 2025, 37 years after the Naked Gun first put them together, Priscilla made a surprise cameo in the franchise's reboot, alongside Liam Neeson and Pamela Anderson, sharing the news with fans on Instagram with a simple line that carried more weight than she probably intended. Over 35 years later, the laughs continue, she wrote. Fans who remembered the original trilogy said they screamed with joy seeing her back in that world, however briefly, a small, full-circle tribute to the man who'd once turned a terrified newcomer into one of comedy's most beloved leading ladies. For a generation raised watching Leslie Nielsen deliver absurd dialogue with a completely straight face, that's really the whole inheritance he left behind. Not just quotable one-liners passed down through decades of family movie nights, but proof that two people who'd each survived their own private hardships could still find something to laugh about together, and that the friendship built on that laughter could outlast almost everything else, even when one of them was no longer there to share it. If this look behind the friendship at the heart of the Naked Gun moved you, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.